Okay, welcome everybody. This is our second workshop. This one tonight is an introduction to working with grief and loss. This is the introduction to the 6-hour one that we're going to be doing for next year. So before we start, I just want to do a check-in. Does everybody know where the chat bar is? If you go to the bottom of your screen and click on the bubble, you'll see it come up on the right hand side. What I'd like you to do is just pop your names in there and any hopes and fears that you've got for tonight's workshop. Throughout, if you've got any questions as well, you can either jot them down or you can put them in the sidebar as well, and we're going to have some time at the end to be able to do some Q&A. So as we go through the session, make a note of any questions, like I said, and any reflections, anything that you think, oh, I wouldn't have tried that in client work, or anything that you want to add and share with the group as well, anything that you've done that we want to talk about tonight. And we'll have, as I said earlier, we'll have an opportunity for check-ins throughout, especially if it's brought up any stuff for anyone, because it is quite a heavy subject. Okay. So we're going to explore different grief and loss models. We're going to explore 2 case studies briefly. When we do the 6-hour, I'm going to extend on them and show you the interventions used and how we integrated the different models, working integratively with the grief models. We're going to explore the influence of attachment styles when working with grief and loss. And we're going to identify the difference between bereavement and grief and loss, and discuss and evaluate our own experiences when working with grief and loss, especially as counsellors, but also sometimes transference is predominant. And I think what I'm kind of picking up in supervisions at the moment a lot of loss around people who were setting up and that has been took away from them, or their jobs are in jeopardy. So there's a lot of loss going on kind of the future that they thought this year was going to be. Also students who haven't ended the courses how they wanted to, and what that's been like for the group process. So if you've been affected by any of that, please feel free to bring it tonight. Okay, so this is just briefly got Liz first. Obviously the name's been changed. So as we go through all of tonight's workshop, I'm going to kind of link these 2 clients and kind of show you how we got to it with them. So Liz presented angry. She was very bitter, frustrated and sad. Her husband had passed away 2 years ago. She lived with her daughter and her partner. She had a really, really close relationship with her daughter and was very, very resentful to the partner once her husband had passed away. And he'd moved in and kind of took over the home as she's seen it. She was resentful of their relationship. She felt he'd come and took her away, so she'd lost not just her husband, but her daughter too. She was frustrated with her friends. She felt no one had time for her. She felt like people didn't understand her. There was no empathy, no sympathy. She was anxious about her own health, and she every week throughout the process of therapy, but also I think about a year before, she started having weekly appointments at the doctor's. And when she was bringing this to therapy, it was very evident that the doctors were really kind of battling with her. She would not stop doing it, and they were kind of concerned she was taking spaces, which she was very angry about. She felt everyone took her for granted. She missed the safety of the relationship she had with her husband. And I worked with her for about 8 months. Next case study is Lisa. Lisa presented very different. She was quiet, sad, confused, anxious, and depressed. Lisa's only son and his family had emigrated to Australia 3 years previous. She lived with her partner. She felt like she had no energy, no motivation. She was struggling to get up for work. She was struggling to make conversations with people. She was just struggling in every part of her life. And isolated herself from friends and family, but then also felt resentful that nobody was there. So that was quite an internal conflict for her. She was confused about what was going on for her and didn't understand the feelings because in her world, she should have got over it by then. It was 3 years ago. Okay, so the way grief affects us and our clients depends on a lot of things, including what kind of loss they've suffered. So your upbringing, your beliefs, religion, your age, relationships, your physical and mental health can all impact it. With both of these clients, integratively, we explored personal construct theory, attachment styles. We obviously began building a foundation with the person-centered model. We explored psychodynamic theories, unconscious defense mechanisms, etc. CBT. TA, we looked at drama triangles, especially for Liz and her daughter and the partner. We looked at grief and loss models. We're going to look at 3 this evening, and then we finished with compassion focused therapy. When we do the longer CPD, I'll be going through each of those with these clients and sharing and practicing interventions that we used, including whiteboard work. Okay. So first of all, I think for any client, the power of clarity, I think, is massively underestimated. But I think working with grief and loss, there's quite a few things I'd like to clarify before we move forward. So the language is huge. The big one for me, which we're going to explore in a minute, is the difference between bereavement and grief and loss, and also how they talk about it, the words that they use, especially shoulds, needs, musts, whys. Their understanding of the process of grief and loss as well, especially attached to their personal constructs, their family's perception of grief and loss, what they think they should be doing, what society says they should be doing, and so on. Their feelings, so kind of determining how they process feelings, how they've been taught to process feelings, what feeling words they use, and obviously using person-centered to build the foundation for integrative. Using a feelings wheel or feeling word document, so that can be broadly explored in a much deeper before we even go on to the grief and loss models. Their perception of loss, like I said, personal constructs and their internal working model, which we're going to look at later on. You know, some constructs in families you may hear, you know, you just have to get on with it. It's just the way it is. You know, you've got to pick yourself up. So that's the language you want to be listening for. And we can explore them using construct theory to kind of ask them, is that actually what they believe, or is that what they've been taught? Attachment style, I think, is massive in grief and loss, because it will determine how they process that grief. And whether there's been any ACEs in their childhood, anything that could be triggered by loss of any kind later in life. And explore the understanding of grief and loss and bereavement, and explore what acceptance, this is the biggest part for me, is first question I ask a client is, when we've worked, most clients will say they want to feel better, they want to get over it, the language they use, whichever they choose. But I would always ask, well, what would acceptance look like for you? And in my experience, not a lot of people can answer that. It's not something we ever ask. And majority of the time, a lot of the clients are already in it, doing things that they would have classed as acceptance. Okay. So bereavement. The word bereavement comes from the ancient German word for seized by violence. Sometimes when someone dies, it can feel just like that, like the person has been forcibly taken away. Today, the word bereavement is used to describe the period of grief and mourning we go through after someone close to us dies. So why bereavement and not grief and loss? And what's the difference? This is something I always explore with clients, especially if no one has passed away, if it's not a person, and they're feeling like they are grieving and feel confused by that. So it's the feelings, experience, emotions, and impact on how we behave can all be the same. What is the difference and why different words? So bereavement and loss can be confusing as the feelings. We may feel from loss, the loss of a person can be the same as the feelings we can experience from the loss of experience from a relationship, job, family, moving away, emigrating. So bereavement is the objective situation of an individual who have experienced the loss of some person or something they valued, and grief is the reaction. So bereavement is who has gone or what has gone, and grief is the process that we go through. So the dual process is both sets of processes have to do with issues of coping. The difference between them is centered on their meaning or focus. So I explore this in great detail with the client, and this is where I'd be gathering personal constructs, their core beliefs, learned behaviours, language that is theirs or that they've picked up or inherited, and we'd explore that throughout. So grief and loss in the counselling room. I just want you to post into the chat as we do this if you have experienced any other presentations of feelings or behaviours of grief and loss in your practice, but these are just some of the ones that I've come across. So feeling sad or down, frequent crying, shock, denial, numbness, stress, anxiety, confusion, exhaustion, anger, guilt, shame, blame, or even relief, loneliness, isolation and withdrawal, feeling or acting differently to usual, physical health problems, headaches, changes in eating or sleeping patterns, difficult concentrating, not enjoying usual activities or hobbies, tension or problems with personal relationships, increased alcohol, smoking or drug use, feeling hopeless or like you can't go on, thoughts of suicide or self-harm. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to go back. So for Liz in this, she was kind of showing sad and down, numbness a lot of the time, but also the stress and anxiety. She had a lot of blame and a lot of loneliness and isolation. The biggest one was the physical health problems. Every week she thought she had something that was going to see her off and no one would care, and her daughter and her boyfriend would be happy and so on. And Lisa was very the opposite. So there was frequent crying, but that was alone. She isolated herself. She didn't enjoy activities. She did have a lot of difficulty concentrating. She had increased her alcohol, but not to a level that she felt she was misusing. There was tension or problems with her partner, and she was feeling hopeless. And the difference with Lisa was that she really couldn't understand what was going on. There was a lot of confusion because she had no one had died. But with Liz, she put it all down to the death 2 years ago. So some stages of grief. We're going to look at different ones throughout this evening. I'm just going to move the chat box over. There we go. So Nima states, accepting that your loss really happened, experiencing the pain that comes with grief, trying to adjust to life without the person or the loss, and putting less emotional energy into your grief and finding a new place to put it. Most people go through all of these stages, but not everyone moves between them smoothly. Sometimes people get stuck on one stage and find it difficult to move on. So both of these clients presented stuck, but for very different reasons. For Liz, she accepted that the loss had happened. For Lisa, that for her there'd been no loss. No one had died. She put the stages of grief with death only, not anything else. Both experienced pain, a lot of pain. Both were struggling to adjust to life. They both went in a place at the point when they came to therapy to put less emotional energy in. It was, for Lisa, there was an unawareness, and for Liz, it was everybody else's fault. So if we did drama triangle here, Liz was very, very much in victim, and Lisa, she was in victim, but for a very different reason, because she was so confused. So during grief and loss, it's important to find ways to mourn our loss and express our grief. This period can be a confusing time for involving a lot of very powerful emotions. These emotions can grow, fade, shift as we move across the stages. Not everyone experiences the same stages at the same time or in the same order. However, most people generally go through the following 4 stages at some point. So as I go through these 4, I'd like you to put into the chat column, which we're going to come to at check-in in a couple of slides. I just want you to choose one of the stages and write down in the chat column how you felt or feel when you've experienced that, or if you'd rather not bring yourself, you're welcome to bring a client. So accepting that your loss has really happened, has that ever happened for you? Experiencing the pain that comes with grief. Trying to adjust to life without the person or loss. And putting less emotional energy into your grief and finding a new place to put it. So if you could just either bring yourself or a client, and have any of them feelings come up for you. This is what I explored with my clients. It's interesting because Liz went straight for ferocity. She was so angry, disgruntled. She had anxiety, whereas Lisa was self-hating. She was rejecting. She had anxiety too. So just have a little think. I'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll come to check-in. Okay. So just to briefly touch on attachment styles. So to fully explore and understand our client process, sitting alongside in empathy, I believe an understanding of their attachment style gives a deeper understanding. So Bowlby states the function of attachment behaviour is protection. Self-awareness, clarity and understanding can be gained when exploring attachment styles and how they unconsciously impact how we manage and navigate the grief and loss. Bowlby further determines whatever pattern is first established tends to persist. So there's 2 types of main attachment styles. We have secure. So an example of a child's reaction for this is to play when mum is there, distressed on separation, comforted when they return, and then play when mum's there again. An adult parent reaction, sensitive, responsive, so the myth of overindulgence, spoiler, helps confidence and trust in self and others. Insecure, we've got anxious, ambivalent, preoccupied, entangled. Avoidant, detached and dismissing, and disorganized, which can look disorientated and unresolved. So just to look at insecure, divided. So we're going to look a bit deeper, insecure, anxious. So the child's reaction, cling to mum, don't play when mum returns, cries harder and will cling more. Parenting style will discourage exploration or over anxious and sensitive to the child's needs and sending confusing messages or inconsistent. Insecure, avoidant, child's reaction, not interested in mum when she's not there or when she returns, and not really calm internally. May show anger against toys as can't against mum, and the parenting is cold, rejecting, does not show feeling, don't tolerate intimacy, and may punish attachment behaviour. Just going to let someone in 1 second. And insecure, disorganized. So the child's reaction may be no fixed strategy, freezing, rocking, a mixture of avoidant and resistant behaviours. The parenting might be frightened and frightening, and irresponsive or over-concerned. Child little influence on the parent's behaviour. So the internal working model, which is likened to the same as our personal constructs, in a sense, it can be compared to that, is internalised from the age of 3. A person's interactions with others is guided by memories and expectations from their model. The features are others as being trustworthy, self as valuable, self as effective in interactions with others, or not, the complete opposite. Transgenerational studies. Child's attachment style depends on parents' internal model, so it's a learned behaviour and a reaction to them of what we've just gone through. The therapist's internal work and model I'll go back. The therapist's internal work and model can also be triggered there by the client. So if we haven't done our own CPD, our own personal development, there could be some real damage in transference that is felt by the counsellor and hopefully should be picked up in supervision or in self-reflection when you come out with your clients. So just briefly to go over how we may recognise attachment style in our clients. So this is what I was looking out for with Liz and Lisa. So if they had secure attachment, I would have heard better coping strategies. They could tolerate both positive, negative feelings, and they had trust in self and others. Both of them showed none of these attachment styles. Anxious, so be over eager to form attachments. Worries partner doesn't love them, or possessive. Now, Liz was like this, but over her daughter. And Lisa felt this with her son who'd gone to Australia. Become distraught when the relationship ends. I would feel Liz was demonstrating that this was happening with all of her friends, but the reality was there was no evidence for it. This was all just how she felt. Can be good at knowing how others feel. Can be seductive. Good at making and retaining friends and supporting others. Potential anxiety disorders, both were presented with this. And dependent and self-critical, both have this. And a lack of trust in self, again, both showed signs of this. Avoidant, so problems with intimacy. Lisa was demonstrating this. Difficulty sharing feelings with others. Liz was very vocal. Lisa really struggled with showing any feelings. Nobody really knew what was going on for her. Self-reliant and independent. And a lack of trust in others. So the usual reaction is, if death is traumatic, then can be extended or extreme. Anxious is dependent, chronic, conflicted if ambivalent. Avoidant is, sorry, the screen's just got funny, difficult expressing grief, may have delayed grief, may find it hard to ask for help. And disorganized, potential psychiatric reactions. When we do the full CPD, we'll look at all of these in much more detail if people haven't really kind of ever used this with grief and loss. Okay, before we go on to the models, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'd just like us to do a check-in and look at some of the conversations that are going on. So has anyone got any questions as yet? You can just put your hand up or put your camera on. Or just put your mic on and ask if you've got a question, it's fine. Nothing. Has anybody ever used attachment styles with grief and loss before? Is that something you've done? Or is this new to anybody? Who's that?
Sorry.
Dan? Sorry, who is it? Pina?
Hi.
Hi, you okay?
I'm fine, thanks. You? Sorry, I'm a bit late.
It's okay.
Finished. So I've used the 5 steps, you know, the bereavement steps, really.
The KUBLER-ROSS?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that the only model you've used, or have you integrated more than one?
Well, that's the only actual model I've used, but I've integrated other things with it, you know, depending on the client and what and how they are, and you can see how they're working with it, you know. So
yeah. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pina. Donna, do you want to talk about yours?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of attachment styles, a bit like the lady before, and I use it integratively, so I wouldn't necessarily be going through each attachment style consciously. Yeah, but I am aware of them. Yeah. Interested on how you would you sit there consciously thinking about each attachment style, or when somebody's presented with a grief.
Yeah. And I would also explore ACEs to see if there's anything there that could have triggered a certain attachment style that could kind of present, because I feel unconsciously when I've used attachment style with clients with grief, when we've gone back and looked at how anything has been lost in their life up till that point, that attachment style just weaves through like a thread. And then once they're aware of it, we can work on that attachment style to change the losses for the future.
Right, okay, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ellie, you said the new to you. Hull.
Yeah, I'm fully aware of attachment style, obviously, but it's not something I've worked with in terms of grief and loss.
Okay.
So I'm finding this quite interesting, actually, especially what you were just saying just a moment ago about, you know, changing the way that they deal with grief and loss in the future if you work with the attachment style. So I'm quite fascinated with that. Yeah.
Oh, good. Dan Jones, what do you love about attachment style?
Listen, my voice sounds like Rod Stewart today. COVID's getting the better of me. I just love attachment theory. It's probably one of my favourite theories. It's kind of something that I find myself always bringing up when I'm in sessions with clients now, trying to find out what their attachment is. I'll be really honest with you, I've never even thought about linking it to grief and loss. I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Good. And I think it's not something I did consciously. It just come up once in a session, and I was like, so explored it more, and it works so well that I just carried on using it. And the more I've used it, I think the more resolve has come and the more resilience to grief and loss has been built. The clients are kind of like understanding of their process, rather, especially Lisa. Her whole process was confusion because no one had died. Her attachment style gave a massive foundation to why that she felt such a loss and grief for her family moving to Australia. Obviously because she'd had a loss, but also it was triggering trauma from childhood, unresolved issues that she was able to explore in therapy. Susie, what you put expand my knowledge, what do you mean by that? Susie's camera's off. Sarah, you put a refresher for you. Your mute's on, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. Yeah, that's right. Just a refresher, really, just to see if I can pick anything else up.
Okay.
And just based on what we were talking about just a second ago, you know, I'm currently working with a client that was abandoned, watched her mum walk out the door. You know, in every relationship she has, she's suffocating them, and than losing all the relationships. So it's very much a huge amount of loss for her. And every time she loses a relationship, it goes back to her mother.
Yeah, brilliant. Can you see do you use attachment style, Sarah, with grief and loss?
Yes, I do actually. I mean, I love attachment anyway. Bowlby's probably one of my heroes up there anyway. So use a lot of that completely and link it in to see how things go with everything works in together.
Yeah, and I think we're very lucky as integrative counsellors because we can use these different models and theories, can't we? Bring it all together and tailor it for our client rather than them just working how we work.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Anybody got any questions before we move on? What we've looked at so far? No? Okay. I will reshare the screen and we'll get back to it. Okay, so we're going to start looking at the models now. I don't use one particular model, and I use different models for both of these clients. So I've included both on here. Okay, so once a therapeutic relationship has begun with the client and exploration, awareness and clarity is being maintained and gathered, I'll begin to introduce the grief models. And I would choose the grief model and I wouldn't choose it for the client. I'd bring a couple, 2 or 3, and let them choose and process which one works best for them. So I'd explore different models, collaborating with the client as to which one they prefer, making certain to further explore how and why they've chosen it. So first of all, KUBLER-ROSS. I think that for me, this is the most common one that you hear about. So she wrote her book, a groundbreaking book on death and dying. The book outlines the 5 stages that dying patients experience. We all know them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So I would show this to clients and see if they can attach to this, if they can see that, yeah, I can see me in that, or I can't see me in this. This was really hard for Lisa KUBLER-ROSS, and I'll get to kind of explain a bit more about that in a minute. Whereas Liz was like, I feel that every day. Every day I'm feeling that. So denial and isolation. The first reaction to learning of a terminal illness or death of a cherished loved one is to deny the reality of the situation. It's a normal reaction to rationalize overwhelming emotions. It's a defense mechanism that buffers the immediate shock. We block out the words and hide from the facts. Liz was doing this, and when her reality of the situation, a reaction to rationalize and overwhelming emotions, had gotten out of control, out of control, and she was then projecting them onto everybody in her life, especially her daughter, and that relationship was massively breaking down. It's a temporary response that carries us through the first wave of the pain, but for Liz, that wave was about 1.5 years long when she got to therapy. As the masking effects of denial and isolation begin to wear, reality of its pain reemerges. We're not ready. The intense emotion is deflected from our vulnerable core, redirected and expressed instead of as anger. The anger may be aimed at inanimate objects, complete strangers, friends or family. And Liz was very much in the midst of this. She would be coming to therapy and she was just so angry and hated everybody, hated her friends, hated the bus driver, and was beginning to resent her husband for passing away as well. Anger may be directed at our dying or deceased. Rationally, we know the person is not to be blamed. Emotionally, however, we may resent the person for causing us the pain. She resented her husband, but she was beginning to resent her daughter for not giving her the safety that her husband had given her since the boyfriend had moved in. Whereas Lisa just felt anger towards herself for feeling the way that she did. We feel guilty for being angry, and this makes us more angry. Definitely how Lisa felt. Bargaining. if we only had sought medical attention sooner, if we'd had a second opinion from another doctor, we'd only tried to be a better person towards them. So secretly we make a deal with God as our higher power in an attempt to postpone the inevitable. This is a weaker line of defence to protect us from the painful reality. Now the client really presented with bargaining. I feel that both the period had been too long to process this part of it. Depression, both stated they had depression. There was two types of depression associated with grief and loss. The first one is a reaction to practical implications relating to the loss. Sadness and regret predominate with this type of depression. We worry about the cost of the burial. We worry that in our grief we've spent less time with others that depend on us. This phase may be eased by simple clarification and reassurance. We may need a bit of helpful cooperation and a few kind words. Second type of depression is more subtle and in a sense perhaps more private. It's our quiet preparation to separate and bid our loved one farewell. And acceptance. I don't think I've ever had a client where any of them have matched. Everybody's view of acceptance, I feel, is different. Reaching this stage of mourning is a gift not afforded to everyone. Death may be sudden and unexpected, and we may never see beyond our anger or denial. It's not necessarily a mark of bravery to resist the inevitable and deny ourselves the opportunity to make our peace. This phase is marked by withdrawal and calm. This is not a period of happiness and must be distinguished from depression. Okay. Coping with loss is ultimately a deeply personal and single experience. Nobody can help you go through it more easily or understand all the emotions that they're going through. No two people will view acceptance the same. And again, this is where I feel in my practice it's vital that my client's viewpoint, what acceptance is explored at that point. So accepting the loss has really happened. So nothing prepares for it. Most people experience severe shock. Clients will be bewildered. For Lisa, the shock was, I don't understand why I'm going through grief and loss when nobody's lost. No one's gone, no one's dead. For a while after the loss, you may find yourself looking out for the person in crowds. You may wake up in the morning. Liz definitely went through this process. Lisa, the complete opposite. And I'm just wondering why make KUBLER-ROSS model be confusing for some clients? I mean, for Lisa, she looked at this and was like, I get it, but it's about death. I see this as death and dying. So that hasn't happened to me, so it can't work for me. So I did not use the KUBLER-ROSS model with her. She did not choose it, and I agree. I don't think it was right for her. For Liz, we looked at this for the death of her husband, but what come out through therapy and through attachment style was that she was grieving the loss of the relationship with her daughter and her identity. She felt unsafe. She had no one there who was her husband, and they did everything together. She felt her friends weren't there. Everyone had left her now. The partner had took over the house. She was grieving who she was before. She was grieving the mother and daughter relationship she had. So when she presented with the death of her husband, it became apparent after a while that she was grieving for relationships and identity more than that. Okay, so just going to come and do another check-in. Going to let somebody in who's coming late. So, Sultana, do you want to ask your question? Are you there?
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
It's okay. Yeah.
I just don't have a question, but it's more an observation that I've made recently, where I was writing an article on grief and loss, but it's more for people who are still very much alive. And it's quite difficult because you want to be able to support clients who are going through such loss, And just listening to this, that there are attachment theory can really help. I've never thought about using attachment theory before. So I'm definitely going to be looking at it more after this session. And yeah, thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. When we do the longer CPD, I have some really good interventions to use with clients. One is how to find out your attachment style, which I do with most clients. It's always fascinating, and there can be so much exploration work done around that one intervention. And then once you've got that foundation, you can use that throughout the sessions while you're exploring the grief. So I'll share that, definitely.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Carmen, you curious? Would you like to expand?
I was just talking to myself. So it's more about to see what you present, how it's presenting, and of course to see, okay, what I'm doing already and what I can discover. So it's quite interesting already how to use the attachment theory and how to get it to the grief side. So it's okay.
All right, brilliant. So has anyone got any questions so far before we move on?
Have you got this on some sort of like, you get any copies, any writing, so that we don't have to keep writing?
Oh, you can Peony, you're going to get the video.
Oh,
yeah. No, Chris is going to send you the video.
Fab.
No problem.
Thank you.
Okay, I will go back to it and we'll carry on. If you got any questions as we go through, just put them down and we'll check them at the end. Okay, experience the pain that comes with grief. So I think again this is very, it's tailored to each client. So some may show sorrow. Both of these clients didn't. Longing to see them again. More so Lisa. She just missed her family in Australia so much. Guilt. Neither of them had guilt. Liz was in too much of a place of anger. She did have guilt through exploration and then overcome that, but Lisa had no guilt. Both had numbness. Both had anger, but displayed differently. Hopelessness again, but displayed differently. Liz's hopelessness was projected out as anger. It's external, and Lisa's was internalized. Both were lonely. And Lisa felt despair. So experience the pain that comes with the grief. So what is felt after a person has died or someone is lost or something's ended will depend on the relationship had with that person and the nature of the death or what was lost. So looking at what types of issues may occur here for the therapist, these are types of things I would explore in supervision or with my supervisees. So a difference in perception of how grief and loss is managed. So making sure we're aware of our own personal constructs or our own internal working model, and allowing to not have that transference build and kind of, I struggled. I took Liz to supervision very early on because her anger with grief and loss, her anger was rage at times. Very different than my process of grieving. So I found that a bit woo at first. Reflection when managing feeling, Lisa really struggled to reflect feelings. Her emotional intelligence was really poor, which is why I think she'd internalized, and her attachment style was very anxious and avoidant. So she was used to kind of stepping away. Relieved or that they've gone or something's ended. How some clients may talk about this can sound shocking at first because it might go against what we believe, but we really have to kind of dig deep there and sit with UPR and empathy. Ken Doe can identify a different way of working. So these are 5 ways in which grief can be disenfranchised. So he talks about the relationship is not being recognised, the griever is not recognised, the loss is not recognised, the circumstance of loss is not recognised, and the grief expressions are not socially acceptable. When I showed this to Lisa, whose son has emigrated, she said, "That's me." Can you turn your mics off, please? She identified with this massively because she said, "I don't feel like I should be grieving, but that is me." Grief and mourning, Bowlby and Parks, their phases of separation response in young children elaborated 4 phases of adult grief. This is a different way of looking at it, which is numbness, yearning and protest, disorganisation and despair, and reorganisation. So just to break them down for you, the numbness, so the duration varies, go on automatic pilot, detached, panic attacks, it's visible to outside, yearning and protest, starting to acknowledge the loss, feeling the void, extreme distress, insomnia, loss of appetite, etc. I would say Lisa identified with these 2. And then we've got disorganisation and despair. So experience emotional distress and acknowledge the loss. Letting go of previous ways of thinking and interacting. Feeling limbo, confusion, uncertainty, and a sense of surrealness. And we've got reorganisation. More of an ability to function and focus, discovering meaning, redefining self and identity, learning new skills, orientation towards the future, and not detaching but reshaping identity. Both clients really liked this model, especially Lisa. She felt like she could work through this, and that's what we did. Working with clients with the importance of the mourning process. Liz had done that. There'd been a funeral, etc., etc. Lisa did this while she was in therapy. Once she became aware that she was in the grief cycle, mourning is an important part of bereavement. Mourning involves rituals like funerals, wakes, anniversaries, celebrations, which help to add structure to an otherwise chaotic and confusing time. Mourning allows us to say goodbye, seeing the body, watching the burial, etc. Lisa couldn't identify this, but then identified with this feeling every time she did a video call to her family. She felt like she went through this in small doses each time, which then she likened to like turning a knife. So this is WORDEN'S model, and this is another model of grief, the tasks of grieving. So accepting the reality of loss, process the pain of grief, adjusting to a world without the deceased, and to find a way to remember the deceased while embarking on the journey of one's journey through life. So accepting the reality, helping the person to tell their story, paying attention to the storyteller and how the story is told rather than merely focusing on the story. Last time the person was seen or contacted, and feelings around the last contact. Seeing or not seeing the deceased person's body if they passed away. Importance of funeral rituals. This was huge for Lisa, especially the story part, because she hadn't told her story because she didn't feel that her story was worth telling. Her son and his family had moved to Australia, and she did not put 2 and 2 together at any point until she came to therapy. The process of pain, the pain of grief. So therapeutic ways of doing this in the counselling room: empty chair work, drawing, letter writing. Both clients, we did empty chair and we did letter writing. The use of photographs and memoirs. When I work with grief and loss, I always offer the clients to bring photographs to therapy if they want to. Once I did have a client who brought the ashes. because they were at home, and she talked about her father so much that she felt it would be nice if he could come to a session. So he came to a session. And the use of metaphor to enhance understanding. It's usually this task that bereaved are susceptible to the myths around grief. They're heading towards acceptance at that point, adjusting to a world without the deceased or loss. So exploring the meaning of coping, feeling fine, okay. And again, this is where personal constructs will come in. So what's the family rules, the perception of coping, feeling okay? What's the internal working model? What was your parents? What's yours? Attachment styles will come here. Is it okay to feel fine and okay? And if it does, when you are fine and okay, what happens? How do people interact with you? But more so, what if you're not fine and okay? And looking at support factors, relationships, helping the client to cope. Liz was in a predicament here because she didn't feel like she had anybody. She pushed everybody away, which she identified towards the end of therapy. Identifying a lack of support or the factors holding back change. And agreeing meaningful goals for change at an appropriate pace. And this is where, when exploring this with clients, CFT can really be used here, which we're going to do a bigger CPD next year. But for those who came, so self-soothing would be really good here, bringing in activities like that. And lastly, we're going to just look at the dual process model. So this is it. So everyday life experiences. So it talks about the loss orientated grief work and restoration orientated work and how the two work together. This isn't probably the one I use the least. I like to use WORDEN'S a lot. KUBLER-ROSS, but tend to use that more so when there's been a bereavement. Feel clients identify more with that when it's actually a person. And just briefly, going to look at this a little bit more in the bigger CPD, but I just wanted to include it for anyone because you may have clients at the moment. So this is the 3 stages of grief suicide as well. So numbness and shock. You'll be able to have a good read of these slides once you've got the video. Disorganisation and reorganisation. Okay. So all clients for me who tend to come with grief and loss present more with depression. So exploring the difference between grief or depression with clients, I think really brings clarity for the client to be able to accept and acknowledge that it's the grief and loss that we're working with, and they're not labeling themselves just depressed. So how do you know if grief has become depression? Grief and depression share a number of symptoms. So sadness, insomnia, loss of appetite, weight loss, hopelessness, and isolation. One of the main differences between grief and depression is that grief comes in waves, while depression is like a cloud that hangs over everything. Sometimes a grieving person is able to forget the sadness for a certain length of time, perhaps when concentrating on something, perhaps when surrounded by people who make them feel happy. Grief is triggered by things, smell, sudden memory, while depression is pervasive, cutting through everything. So I would explore all of these with the client, find out what's going on for them when they're feeling depressed, and bring in some evidence as well, some psychoeducation. So I think if you're going to kind of distinguish something like this and separate it, I think everything has to be evidence-based. So the clients kind of can go, okay, so that's why, rather than it sound like an opinion. So signs that grief has turned into depression may include feelings of guilt unrelated to the recent loss. So I would explore all of these. A feeling that you're worthless, feeling sluggish, drained and confused. So for Lisa, over the 3 years, definitely her grief had kind of slid into depression. Struggling to speak coherently, difficulty carrying out everyday tasks, hallucinations with some clients. Okay. So I'd just like to stop the share and like a quick, nice, I think, grief discussion. So what have you practiced differently? So we've looked at quite a few models. We've looked at attachment styles. I would also explore ACEs. And integratively, I would tend to work within grief, person-centered, psychodynamic, CFT, TA, depending on how the client presents, and CBT. But I just would like to know what you've practiced differently. How did your clients present? Were they different from Liz and Lisa? And how did their understanding of acceptance differ from yours? Because that's one I think as counsellors we can tend to take to supervision, because for acceptance for me is quite positive and uplifting, but for a lot of clients it's just about not feeling as bad tomorrow than they did yesterday. It's not about feeling good. And what have you learned this evening that may influence working with grief and loss? Okay, I'm going to come back and we will open up the chat column. Okay. Christine, letter writing is amazing. Would you like to tell us more?
Just briefly, that I've done it with one client who had carried guilt round for like 40 odd years. And it even still gives me shivers because it was virtual. And we decided that she was going to burn it. And as she burned it afterwards,
yeah.
And I said, you know, is there anything that you would like to add? And she said, I want to let go of the guilt. And as she said it, the flame actually disappeared.
Wow.
And that was so empowering for her. And it still gives me goose pimples when.
Oh, your sound keeps going down a little bit, Christine.
That is empowering. Letter writing is so empowering for clients, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think whether it's to someone or themselves, I think both are just amazing, aren't they?
Yeah.
Okay, totally. Thank you. Ashley, tell them the story.
Sorry, my mic was on mute. I think when somebody is allowed to tell the story, it validates their feelings and gives importance to it and the space to be heard, because sometimes if you repeat your story constantly to close family members or friends or whatever,
yeah,
you're frightened that you're becoming a burden. So I think a lot of clients who I've worked with have found that just safe space to say exactly what they feel and the story behind it and why they feel the way that they do.
Do you feel when clients do that, Ash, that if they feel validated? Because I think what I try to remind myself all the time is we have that space with people all the time, but some clients have never been heard, and no. I think it's very easy to take it for granted because we have that space a lot. And I think when you see that client's reaction to being heard, their story for the first time, it's quite overwhelming, isn't it?
It's massively overwhelming. If a client, when you have those first couple of sessions, this is not a technical term, they just verbally vomit, and it's like, and they're getting everything out so quickly that it's the newness of being heard.
Yeah.
And they just want to tell you everything that goes with it.
Yeah.
I've found that the fact to differentiate between death and loss is a big thing with clients as well.
Yeah, I agree. Huge. And I think I chose these two case studies because of that, because there was one that was a death and one that wasn't. And yet we used the same way of working for both. They were both lost. Are you still there, Ash?
I am, yes.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry, I thought you
Sorry,
weren't then.
I was letting you finish.
Sorry, we've got about sound keeps going on and off, so I was just checking.
Sorry.
But yeah, no, I agree. I think the power in storytelling is just unbelievable.
I agree with Christine that the letter writing is very powerful as well.
Yeah, I think storytelling, however that's done, isn't it? Just the most powerful thing. Thanks, Ash.
Thank you.
Andy, would you like to share yours? I know it's personal, so you don't have to if you don't want to.
Hi, yeah, is Mum? Yeah, I'm on mute now. Yeah, so I come across the attachment styles model. I went for a breakup this year, and I did a bit of it was like a self-help course to try and overcome it because it hit me really hard on a personal level.
Yeah.
And what I realised was that my ex was very an avoidant attachment style, and I was more of an anxious attachment style.
Right.
And in the slide tonight, he said about how an anxious attachment style, you're more likely to feel distraught, and that's like what I went through. And I went through that the physical sensation as well, like the insomnia, like the stomach, chronic stomach pains. I had to go to my GP and get put on some medication because it was manifesting itself physically in me. But in terms of the attachment styles, it's very it gives a good context as to how we deal with our own grief.
Yeah.
And that it really hit the point home to me going through that experience recently, through that breakup, because also with going through a breakup, there's it's a bereavement process, but if you're the person who's been broken up with, then there's the rejection that adds onto that as well. So that's what I went through. So that's come to light for me more recently because I've gone through it on a more personal level.
Okay. When you felt that attachment, those symptoms, the physical symptoms, Andy, to that, could you relate that to past experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think if we haven't got that awareness and our clients haven't, when you kind of attach and link those experiences throughout life, I think so much understanding comes, doesn't it? And also it helps relieve those physical symptoms and make sense of them, I think, is the biggest thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for sharing.
That's fine, not a problem at all.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Margaret, would you like to talk about yours? Just need to turn your mute off, Margaret. You're still off. And I'll unmute you. One sec.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Okay. When I draw the KUBLER-ROSS curve for people, I kind of draw it with, instead of it going sort of like progressing through the stages and getting to acceptance and finding meaning and stuff, I draw a red line with it going back again.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right back up to denial and shock and stuff. And I've found that that's very helpful for people, because when they say I've got good and I've got bad days, and I like share with them then things like, look, I've had a bad day, today, and like I wake up and I'm right back at shock and denial,
yeah,
and sort of share that experience with them and say that, I suppose it's what you were saying, what does this success look like? And you've got to like say, what does it look like to you and what does it look like to the client? But I say, so for me, success sort of looks like less times going down the snake, less time going back down the red thing, and more times up the right hand side. But like it's okay and it's perfectly normal to regress. And I've just clicked with people sort of talking like that, really.
Yeah, I think you really have to be available, don't you, to dig deep with it and really kind of work. Which model do you prefer, Margaret? KUBLER-ROSS?
Well, my last year in college, we had to do a sort of a thing on the DSM, which I hate. I hate this book with a passion, but we had to do something. And so I chose a persistent complex grief disorder, or some such title.
Okay.
And I sort of looked at all these models, and there was the KUBLER-ROSS model, and then I can't remember the name of the chap, but he's added the sixth thing, hasn't he, finding meaning. And I thought, well, this is great, but it's too static, and it's too like, you know, duh, you go through this, then you go through that, and don't. Yeah. And that just didn't resonate with me. Because for somebody who has been stuck in grief, well, who was stuck in grief for 20 years, I feel I know quite a lot about this, you know. And I just thought, well, this is all fine, but some days I'm like right back up here at denial, and I'm having an attack of the killer whys. And, you know, an attack of the killer whys is like you're right back there, you know. And so for me, and I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just saying this is what I have to do to be authentic and to be present with clients. I've got to take these models and like say, do they work for me? Yeah. And then like put them back in my own words and like give them back to clients that way. Yeah. And so I don't know if that answers your question, Joe. But...
Well, yeah, I think what you say, see, wouldn't say I have a model I work with. I tend to kind of go with my gut with the client, and then it's whatever is their story, the model that fits for them, depending on it. So it's kind of more a gut reaction. But I am the same as you. I like to look at the models, interpret them, make sense of them, and then explore them.
Yes.
But I think you just know, and I think I don't always use one particular one. We may explore different aspects, like I went through this evening. You know, Liz like some of that KUBLER-ROSS, but others of Worden and so on. It's about understanding the loss, not necessarily being fixed to what one person decides as a theory. It's about being able to work integratively.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the attachments, I mean, it's not something I've sort of got into massively yet, but with the attachment, again, in myself, I feel, well, with this person, I was securely attached. With that person, I was avoidant. With that person, you know, so it's not like you're one definite thing all the time.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
And I think it's attached, for me, learning and bringing attachment into grief and loss has just opened up a deeper awareness for clients, I think. Being able to kind of look and resolve and talk through things that past losses that have resonated, and it's like Jenga have stacked up, and being able to work through it and understand their grief system, their attachment, resolves a lot of other things than what just the clients come with. That's for me. That is what it is. Thanks, Margaret.
Okay.
Lastly, Paul, do you want to do yours quickly? Said about using.
Yeah, similar to what other people have mentioned, we use the letter, which is really, really powerful to get all those unspoken emotions, those last things that they wanted to say, that they felt that they hadn't said, but not necessarily good things. Potentially bad things as well. So anything that they felt was unsaid. And the client's very spiritual, so they believe a lot in crystals and the power of the universe, and they brought that into the room, and they figured that helped, and they looked for my acceptance, and I basically just said, but if you're comfortable using that alongside what we're doing and that works for you, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And she's very tactile in terms of things, having things around from her dad, because she lost her dad, that she could touch if she felt that she'd missed him or she'd lost him. But the beautiful moment was when she was able to let him go, and you could see it in her. She came into the session. It was just completely. She was so much lighter, and crying with joy, not necessarily grief anymore. The fact that she let him go and could enjoy him and not mourn for him anymore.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so what I'll do now, guys, I'm just going to go back to sharing the screen, and we'll finish off the last couple of slides. It's a little bit about the progression, really, onto the next one. Okay, So hopes and fears. I'd just like you to have a look at the hopes and fears that you wrote at the beginning. So what have you learned this evening that may influence working with grief and loss? If anyone's got any more questions that we haven't already discussed tonight, feel free to post them onto the Facebook group, or you can send them to Chris and I'm happy to answer them. Also, the wider reading, there's quite about 3 slides after this, the end of the PowerPoint with all the references on, if anybody wants to do any further wider reading or some study. So the 6-hour CPD that we're going to do next year, we're going to kind of, this was the introduction, this was tiny snippets of all of that. So we're going to deepen awareness on the models of grief. We're going to kind of evaluate them and justify them, attach to client work. We're going to explore and evaluate attachment styles and look at them in a broader and deeper exploration. We're going to explore working integratively with grief and loss using the case studies. So I will go through how we integratively attached all of the different models and theories, and at what kind of do a plan, a case formulation, and go through that. I'm going to develop awareness of whiteboard work. I use whiteboard work in most sessions with my clients, even if it's just writing up feelings. But I'll share some interventions of how I use that with grief and loss. I'm going to develop personal and professional development, because all the interventions in CPD you can use on yourself to gain some self-awareness in the session. And we're going to examine and evaluate the impact of transference with grief and loss. It's something I'm always aware of as a therapist, and it's something I'm always aware of as a supervisor as well to check out, because it's one thing we all have in common, everyone, our clients and us. So thank you for your participation this evening. If you want to continue on to the CPD next year, we haven't got a date yet, but you can email Chris. And again, like all of our supervisions and our CPDs, your importance is invaluable, and it helps me change and develop how we do things. So any feedback, if you could email it to Chris, I would be very thankful. So I'm just going to stop sharing and come back. Has anyone got any questions before we go? You can pop it in the chat side, or you can turn your mic off and just ask now. No? Okay. Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Natasha, in the chat. Thank you, Paul. That's the last of the CPD now till Christmas, because we've only got a couple of weeks. We've got one more peer supervision left, which is next Tuesday, and then we'll be having a little bit of time off for Christmas, and then we'll be right back at it. Hopefully you're all coming to the Christmas party on Saturday. I've got my glasses ready, my Christmas glasses, bought 3 new pairs just for Saturday. It'd be lovely to see you all there. Thanks, Donna, for your comments. Everyone have a lovely night, and if you've any questions, just let me know, okay? Thanks, Dan. See you later. Bye-bye.